So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center on a Friday morning. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you tuning in and joining us here in person for our conversation with Commissioner Kevin McAleenan of Customs and Border Protection. Really quickly, just a little bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center for those who may not know us. We are a bipartisan think tank. Yes, that does exist in D.C. We've been around for about 10 and a half years. We were founded by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, and George Mitchell, with the goal of bringing together Republicans and Democrats in strong partisanship to try to come to agreement, forge compromises, the difficult work of making policy. And to that end, we cover on a whole lot of issues, including immigration and border security that we're going to talk a little bit about today. Just a little bit of format. We will be talking for 45, 50 minutes or so. We will have opportunity for questions. Those here in the room, you have cards. We'd like you to please write your questions out anytime during this. Just hold them up or pass in the end. We'll have people collecting them, and then we will go through them with the commissioner later. If you are online and watching us and you'd like to submit a question, you can send that via Twitter with the hashtag BPCLive. Thank you very much. And with that, let me introduce CBP Commissioner Kevin McAleenan. Kevin was sworn in March of this year as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He had been the acting commissioner since January of 2017 and the initiation of this administration. Prior to that, though, he was Deputy Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection under the prior administration. He's also served in operational capacities throughout the agency. He's been the head of the Office of Anti-Terrorism. He was the Port Director and Field Office Director in Los Angeles. He also is an attorney and practiced law for a while in California, so he's had a very broad and no, I don't have anything against attorneys. Anyway, he's been a senior executive in the U.S. government since 2006. He has won the Presidential Rank Award, the Service to America Medal, the Call to Service Award. He is a very well-respected and honored public servant, and we are happy to have you here, Commissioner McAleenan.
It's good to be here, Teresa. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. I want to start out kind of basic. There are a lot of folks paying attention to the immigration debate who haven't before right now. It seems to be in the news a bit. And I see a lot of people sort of maybe struggling a little bit understanding the various agencies that work in the space. So tell me about, just let's define CBP's mission, Customs and Border Protection, what it does, what offices it has. Let's define that. In particular, what it doesn't do.
Sure.
So let's get to that.
That's a good place to start.
Place to start at the beginning,
So U.S. Customs and Border Protection is a unified border security agency of the United States. We're in all 50 states, 40 countries around the world. We've got 4 main operating components. The first that everyone's focused on right now is our U.S. Border Patrol. They're responsible for securing the borders between ports of entry. At Southwest border primarily, that's where the bulk of our agents are, but we also patrol the northern border and maritime approaches in Miami, coast of California, and so forth. So that's 1. 2 is our Office of Field Operations. These are CBP officers, blue uniformed individuals at the ports of entry. You fly back from Europe, you cross the border from Tijuana to San Diego through the lawful ports of entry. That's where CBP officers operate. They're responsible for securing the flows through the ports for counterterrorism purposes, for counter-narcotics, a variety of functions there. Third is our Office of Air and Marine Operations. We actually have the largest civilian air force in the world, supporting the border security operations at the land border, of course, but also in the maritime approaches and in the source and transit zone for narcotics trafficking. And then fourth, our Office of Trade. 1,000 people strong, monitoring the movement of $4 trillion in trade across our borders, applying the policies appropriately across the whole manner of commodities, ensuring that people can't evade our trade laws and our duties and tariffs, ensuring that intellectual property rights are protected, and that we keep forced labor out of supply chains. So a whole variety of operations, but it's border focused. And so our immigration efforts are focused on apprehending anyone crossing illegally, and then, of course, processing lawful trade and travel. Over 98% of travelers arriving at our ports of entry are fully compliant with all our laws and are processed accordingly.
Right. So just to be clear, we want to differentiate Customs and Border Protection. The Border Patrol is an office within Customs and Border Protection. This is one of my personal pet peeves. Anybody who's followed me on Twitter knows this. The agency is Customs and Border Protection.
Correct.
Border Patrol is an office within CBP. So for those writing about this today, let's get the acronyms right. Okay. And also differentiating your mission from that of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is another agency that's in the news a lot right now.
Right.
Can you tell us how you work together and where your missions collide or are separate?
Yeah, we have critical partnerships with ICE. First, Homeland Security Investigations. They are key investigative partners for transnational crime, whether it's smuggling of people, whether it's smuggling of narcotics. They're the #1 agency we work together to follow up with, in addition to FBI, DEA, and other partners.
So they're the investigators?
Correct.
Okay, so when you find something at a port of entry that needs follow-up, a longer-term investigation, that's who you work with?
Exactly. We make a drug seizure at a port of entry. HSI is our partner that we work with to investigate that network, to work with DOJ to prosecute that case.
Great.
And then, of course, enforcement and removal operations. That's the arm of ICE that takes custody of those that we apprehend crossing our border illegally or who present at our ports of entry and are determined to be inadmissible. They also transport unaccompanied children to Health and Human Services, and they have that responsibility for unaccompanied children under law.
Okay, so once your role is done at the border, ICE is the one that takes over sort of that
Correct.
portion of it. Okay, just to get that clear. So you mentioned a lot of different things that CBP does,
Right.
monitoring trade, looking for transnational criminals, smuggling of narcotics and drugs and other money and guns and other things across the border. But we hear all the time right now, right, about immigration. Can you talk to a little bit about how you balance all of those missions? Where are your resources focused? How do you look at all of them? And how do you balance those varied missions?
Well, we have to do it all.
Yeah.
In the Senate Finance Committee, during the confirmation hearing, they pointed out that I have 19 enumerated duties as Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and they are broad in scope, but we've got a tremendous leadership team. We've got a good organizational structure that's been, since 2015, actually in law. We're authorized as a real agency, and we've got tremendous executives. I think, as demonstrated by the fact that my last 2 acting deputies have been selected for leadership at other agencies in DHS, at Secret Service, Texalis, and now at ICE, and Ron Vitello.
Yeah. Well, I do have to ask that, though, because there's still a lot of people with acting in their titles at CBP. You have a lot of a deep bench, I think.
Sure.
I think your Director of Field Operations is now acting deputy. Is that where you're at right now?
Nope.
So, nope, see, I didn't get it right.
Sure.
So Ron Vitello, who was Chief of the Border Patrol, is acting deputy, is now moved over to act as head of Immigration Customs Enforcement right now.
He's the permanent career deputy director, and he's the acting director of ICE, correct.
Great. So who is now your deputy?
Who's my deputy? Bob Perez.
Bob Perez,
the former Director of Field Operations in New York.
Great.
He's also he's been the Executive Assistant Commissioner for Operations Coordination, one of our 6 highest ranking operating officials at CBP.
Field Operations. Okay, so a little bit of shuffling around there. How does that, you have people that you really worked with for a long time and they move around. How does that help you or hurt you, either in working with the other agencies or in getting your own mission done?
Well, I think you said it well. We've got a deep bench. We have a very strong executive core. They're all career professionals that have had a variety of roles. They've served in the field, they've served in leadership at headquarters, they served in interagency jobs. And so they bring a lot to the table, and we're able to kind of backfill effectively. And I think really with this extension of career experience and leadership, we have a former Coast Guard admiral who's the administrator of TSA, for instance. We've got a lot of experience working together. You can advance projects and priorities more effectively knowing the history and the background of your fellow leaders.
So a lot of institutional knowledge as well as executive.
Yeah, I think it's a strong group for the department.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's turn to migration.
Sure.
And immigration. I know in previous interviews you've spoken about the changes in the types of immigrants that are coming. Traditionally at the southwest border it was dealing with a lot of Mexican migration.
Correct.
That's not who we're seeing right now. Can you talk a little bit from the operational perspective? Different types of people coming with different types of needs or wants or desires and coming in. How does that change how you what strategies you use at the border and how you operationally manage that flow.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because it's a really dramatic difference over the last 5 years. Even it's changed over decades, but really the last 5 years are the most significant. As you noted, historically the patterns of illegal migration between ports of entry on the southwest border have been driven by Mexican citizens who are coming for seasonal work. That was the primary pathway from the 30s through 2009. 2009 was the first year that we dropped below 90% Mexican nationals crossing our border between ports of entry illegally.
And it's declined since then, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
3 of the last 5 years have been more than 50% non-Mexican nationals.
Right.
2 other signal changes. We had usually almost all single adults, and usually males. 90% through 2008 were single adults. Now we see this year a full 40% of those crossing our border are either children unaccompanied, that's 15%, or family units, 25%.
And those family units, are they mostly adult females and children, adult males and children, or a combination?
It's a mix, but primarily adult females, and usually only one child. That's another change we've seen even in the last 5 years. The third phenomenon, though, I'd like to focus on is from 2000 to 2013. Fewer than 1% of those apprehended between ports of entry or encountered without documents at our ports claimed asylum.
Okay, so it's still a relatively small percentage.
No, that was from 2000 to 2013.
2013 it changed.
Now we're at 20% on average, just
claims.
to CBP. And then, of course, additional asylum claims are made to ICE officers, are made to CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services.
The third immigration arm.
Immigration
we didn't
Bureau.
talk about that. Acronym heavy up here.
Indeed, or to immigration judges later in the process. So it's actually that phenomenon of seeking asylum, of claiming fear of return, has a dramatic increase over the past 5 years.
So, for example, the facilities along the U.S.-Mexico border that were built, for Border Patrol and field operations at the ports of entry were basically built for people that can be processed fairly quickly and turned around into either passed on to ICE or returned back home fairly quickly, very temporary. This process takes a little longer when you're having to deal with, and again, you said mostly adult males, so facilities that are okay for children or families or segregated. I mean, how are you managing that? Are you adapting your facilities? Are you looking at new facilities? I mean, if this is a long-term change, we've now seen this over 5 years. Looking forward, what do you need to do to adapt to this new flow? Yeah,
and that's an important point, I think, for people to understand. Our Border Patrol facilities were built in the 80s and 90s, many of them. Some of them were reinvested in the 2010, 2011 timeframe. They were built for single adults. Think of like a police station, like short-term detention before they're turned over to a jail or a longer-term facility. In immigration, it's for ICE. So that they weren't built to handle families and children. So in Rio Grande Valley, which is where we see about 50% of border crossings the last 5 years, about 45% this year. We've tried to adjust. We've created a central processing center that is specifically tailored to temporarily and hopefully very short term house families and children in a much more open setting, in a less custodial setting where we can provide better services. But we're going to have to keep looking at that. If this is a phenomenon that's going to continue in this manner, if we're not going to find legislative solutions, then I'd love to get to solutions.
We'll talk about that.
If we're not going to be able to partner internationally to address some of the flow concerns, we have to have a better arrival point for children and families. We don't want them crossing between ports of entry and ending up in a Border Patrol station.
So that leads to a conversation that's been happening. The Secretary has said, people should come to the ports of entry if they want to apply for asylum, not between the ports of entry. So what happens walk us through this process. If somebody arrives at a port of entry and says, I want to claim asylum, can you walk through exactly what your CBP officers do at that point?
Sure.
And what's necessary to just accommodate that?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to emphasize. It is lawful to present at a port of entry without documents and claim fear of return and seek asylum. And that is the appropriate place to arrive and make an asylum claim in the U.S. So when that happens, when a family or an individual or an unaccompanied child approaches a CBP officer at a port of entry, they're interviewed, they're taken a sworn statement, they're asked if they have fear of return, and then they're set up appropriately for transfer to ICE for potentially seeing a a CIS asylum officer to determine whether they do have a valid fear of return, and they're not separated if they're a family. It's a very important point. It's lawful. There's no prosecution.
You're separating children. Shame on you. Shame on you. How do you sleep at night? How do you sleep at night? History will judge you. You're a human rights abuser.
Excuse me.
You're a human rights abuser. Shame on you.
Excuse
How
me.
do you sleep at night? How do you sleep at night? Shame on
Would you please leave?
Shame on you.
Excuse me.
How do you sleep at night? You're a
We'd like to have
child
our
abuser.
conversation.
You're orphaning children. You're kidnapping children. How do you sleep at night? How do you sleep at night? Shame on you.
Okay. I believe we were talking about what happens at ports of entry.
Sure.
Now, you did say that when they arrive at ports of
I was
entry, the
explaining that
families
families are not separated at ports of
separated.
entry. Right.
That was not necessarily the case previously, or that was the case under the zero tolerance policy between ports of entry?
So the process at the ports did not change.
Did not change,
at
okay.
all. In fact, it's been consistent. If you arrive without documents, you claim asylum, you're transferred to ICE, you see a CIS officer, your claim is adjudicated appropriately.
Now, how long does it take that process to go to port of entry? Because we have heard that in some places, people are asked to wait. The port of entry can't accommodate the number of people. They're asked to wait in Mexico. Sometimes that's difficult for them, and some of them choose at that point if they have to wait for a long time. Excuse me.
The cries of the child or the parent.
Excuse me.
Just because I know the child is very helpless, but the parent ripping the arms of the child, the parent must be. So,
what we were saying.
Right.
How long does that process take at the port of entry? How long? I mean, we have a long wait in our backlogs in our courts, but you said a transfer to ICE, and there's processing capacity at the ports of entry. What challenges are you having there?
Right, that's another important point. So we have 550,000 people coming to our ports of entry, lawfully crossing into the U.S. every day at our 26 southern border crossings. They've got those multiple missions, right? They have to facilitate that lawful travel. They're looking for narcotics. Take San Ysidro, the biggest port of entry in the Western Hemisphere, 130,000 people a day. It's also the most significant port for seizing narcotics at our southwest border. So they've got to try to balance all that lawful travel, the narcotic seizures, as well as making sure there's access for people that don't have documentation and want to present an asylum claim. So they can't take everyone who's there every day at a port like San Ysidro just because of the numbers. So we try to communicate that with the shelters in Tijuana. We work with Mexican immigration to appropriately meter the arrivals so that we can accommodate everybody, because we don't have space to hold more than a few hundred people per day, even at our biggest port of entry. Right. In the rest of the southwest border, we do monitor carefully if we run out of capacity or space for housing people without documents. We do ask them to wait and come back at another point. We are not denying access to the U.S. We are not denying access for people that are seeking asylum without documentation at ports of entry. But it is something we have to monitor and balance across other missions.
Are you looking at ways to provide additional resources to the ports of entry where you're seeing this uptick? I mean, again, if you're encouraging people to come there rather than between ports of entry, but you're having capacity issues, how do you scale that? How do you manage that?
Yeah, again, this is primarily an issue at San Ysidro, where it's our largest port of entry. It's where most people arriving without documentation, without documentation or seeking asylum, that's where we see that wait time. And we do try to work carefully with the shelters and with Mexican immigration on managing it. But that's something that I think really takes us to the bigger picture challenges here and the solutions we have to approach with our partners in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras under the Alliance for Prosperity. The U.S. government's invested and applied $2 billion to help both create economic opportunity at home. This is a regional migration flow. It's driven by economic concerns and lack of economic opportunity. That's really fundamental to understand. There's a lot of discussion about gang violence. There's a lot of discussion about coercion, but economics is the fundamental core of this. So this administration is expanding on the scope of the Obama-era initiative and on the Alliance for Prosperity. We're partnering with Mexico. We're engaging with the Central American governments. My boss has met 3 times in the last several weeks with leaders from the Northern Triangle countries. I've been down to Guatemala recently. We'll be going back in September as CBP to bring collaboration initiatives from processing people at ports of entry to enhancing the integrity of the customs process to vetted units. We're gonna work across the board to see if we can help.
Tired,
your poor, your huddle masses yearning to be free. There is no conditioning on that.
Excuse us.
It is a promise to the world. A bipartisan promise to the world.
Please let us finish our conversation. Can you please let us finish our conversation? Thank you.
Give me your tired.
All right. So you mentioned the work in Central America, and I know you said that a lot of this is economics, but the asylum seekers are fleeing what they believe is for their lives. I mean, they're coming and saying that they or their children are being haunted by gangs or criminals. The economics may push people into that criminality, but is it a priority to address the criminal situation in those countries?
Absolutely.
I mean, that would be, I think.
The security and governance there are three pillars of the Alliance for Prosperity.
Okay.
It's creating additional economic opportunity, it's addressing the security situation in 3 Northern Triangle countries, and it's enhancing the governance and integrity of processes with U.S. and ideally international support. So that's first and foremost. We've talked with these leaders. They don't want to lose their youth and energy to this migration flow. They don't want to put their vulnerable families and children in the hands of smugglers. And I think that's the second thing we really need to talk about, is what's happening on the journey north in Mexico. Doctors Without Borders released a report last week. 2/3 of migrants coming through, and this is their data. We think it's actually a little higher from our intelligence and interviews, but 2/3 of the migrants that are in the hands of smugglers are facing crime in the process. They're assaulted, they're robbed, they're extorted, and this is a really very concerning stat. 1/3 of women and girls are sexually assaulted in this process, and this is happening while they're going through Mexico in the hands of transnational criminal organizations. The other phenomenon that we can't ignore, this administration has been very clear that our drug demand in the U.S. creates many of the violence and governance problems that we face in Central America and that Mexico faces. Our legal framework for immigration, our legal system that's inviting people to take this dangerous journey is creating the same sort of concerns and demand. This is a multi-billion-dollar profit center for the TCOs, and the damage they're doing collaterally to the Mexican nationals that live on this route is tremendous. In Tamaulipas, which is a state immediately south of Rio Grande Valley in southern Texas, the murder rate has more than doubled in the last 18 months alone. 122 candidates for political office in Mexico were murdered at the federal, state, and local level in the last election cycle. Several hundred had to quit or drop out due to threats. That's a result of our legal framework. And so I think we've got to be cognizant of what our system is doing, both to Central America and to Mexico, and how we need to partner with them to address both the push factors, create the economic opportunity at home in Central America, to attack the TCOs that are victimizing the most vulnerable people in our hemisphere on their route here, and then we can work on the border issues and the internal side of the immigration enforcement system, which I know we'll get to.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're basically saying that the solution to this isn't going to happen at the border, and yet that's where all this attention has been, and the most immediate policy changes have been happening at the border,
right,
with, I guess, at least some administration officials have said, with the idea of deterring this flow. As you mentioned, all of these terrible things are happening to people on this journey. You know, what must cause somebody to be willing to take all of those risks, given where they were, to try to make that journey? You know, if the idea is that these policy changes are somehow going to deter that, I mean, what's your sense? How do you know if any of this is working?
All right, that's a multi.
Yeah, that was a big question.
Multi-factor question. So why don't we start with what can happen at the border?
Yeah.
So I just want to focus. That is part of the solution as well. And we've had bipartisan support for investments in border security, the ability to impede and deny people from crossing in different areas, situational awareness so that we can see who's crossing and then move to apprehend them, the mobility, and then of course personnel. And on our ports of entry, we've seen a significant investment now in non-intrusive inspection technology. There's been tremendous improvements in the capability of that kind of technology so that we can identify hard narcotics that's smuggled in tiny packages, right? You look at synthetic opioids, they're 50 times more potent than heroin on average. Think of how small that shipment can be to still create thousands of drug doses in the U.S. We've got to try to find that in an axle, in a gas tank, in a spare tire there in a vehicle crossing the border. So the $250 million we received in FY19 to improve that capability, that's a tremendous aspect of border security that we need to continue to invest in. But you're absolutely right, Teresa, that this can't be solved at the border alone. CBP's job is to apprehend people crossing, to determine their status, and then to put them into the immigration system, starting with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We need effective courts. You've highlighted that. We need enough judges to fairly, transparently, and consistently adjudicate these claims and assess whether someone has a claim for asylum, whether they deserve protections in the U.S., or whether they should be repatriated. That's not happening today. That's happening 2 to 5 years out. So that people, even if they're not eventually going to get a valid opportunity to stay in the U.S., are waiting in the court system for years at a time. That invites additional migration and additional people to try through this dangerous journey. You asked why they would put themselves at this risk if they know how dangerous this journey is, and I would say many don't know. You mentioned how it's changed at the border. This process of smugglers controlling the access is really a phenomenon of only the last 5 to 10 years. Previously, if you wanted to migrate to the U.S., you could kind of chart your own path, get transportation up to the Mexican border, see where other people are gathering, and try to cross together with a group. Now you can't get access to that border without paying a smuggler. That's why that violence is so intense right now in Tamaulipas. They're fighting over every inch of access to that river. It's $500 additional fee just for that last inch to cross into the U.S. And so many people don't know that. They came earlier. We see a lot of family reunification in this current migration flow, people coming to be with relatives that came in the 2000s, and they're attempting this journey because they don't realize how dangerous it is and what can happen to their family. That's why we're trying to get the message out. We're currently working with Central American governments and with our own messaging campaign to explain the dangers of that journey and also to appeal to the potential for the future and the economic opportunity at home. So we're trying to make that clear.
So how effective do you think this messaging is, right? We're still seeing numbers of families at the border, even with a lot of tough talk from the administration, from the president about not doing this, and policies that were meant to, for whatever reason, try to show we have zero tolerance for people arriving, no matter the claims you might have. Have you seen a decline? Have you seen any fewer people coming, or is it still the same flow that we've seen before?
So this messaging I just referenced is launching this month. So we'll get back to you on whether it's effective in reaching the audience and creating that deterrence. It's going to be in Spanish, it's going to be in indigenous dialects, and hopefully it will resonate. In terms of the broader message, I mean, you noted that when President Trump was inaugurated, migration dropped dramatically, 45-year low in 17, and that was the stated clear intent to enforce immigration law more effectively. Unfortunately, the legal system hasn't changed. We still have a scenario where if we have a gap in people who initially claim fear of return, being told you have a credible fear, you might be able to prove an asylum case. That's about 80%. But at the end of the process, only about 20% are being found by an immigration judge to warrant asylum. The problem is that happens 2 to 5 years out. That's something the administration can't change overnight. There needs to be legal and statutory action, and they've asked Congress to change that policy. Secondly, for children coming from Central America or further away, there's very little chance of being repatriated. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which is a very important statute to protect victims of trafficking, especially unaccompanied children, kids from Central America or further away do not end up being repatriated. If you're a Mexican child, there's a 97% chance you'll be repatriated timely through a process with the government of Mexico, or a child from Canada. But if you're from further away, we've only seen 3% of those children repatriated since 2014. So that's an incredible invitational pull as well.
Let me ask you though, that act was meant to prevent trafficking.
Correct.
If we were to close down some of those avenues, would that push some of those children more into the hands of traffickers to try to avoid those consequences?
Well,
I mean, that's one of the questions I have, is whether or not some of the actions that we're doing is actually encouraging the smugglers to be more creative and to do more. You know this better than anybody, that every time you take an action against drugs, against smuggling, against whatever, there's a response from the other side. You mentioned it's criminal activities. These are money-making activities for these smugglers. They adapt and they, feed misinformation because that helps them have more clients and make more money. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the intended effects of the policies with what could end up countering those?
Yeah, it's something we need to continue to evaluate, and that's an important policy debate to have about how to reform some of these, what we would call legal loopholes, which people think are critical protections, because they are both, right? You have to balance that, and that's a discussion we need to have. Right now, we have a double standard. For Canadian and Mexican children, they're repatriated almost all of the time. For children from further away, it's just access to the U.S. that doesn't have any deterrent impact, even if there's not a valid claim for protection or a trafficking issue. So that's something we need to work on. So the asylum side, and then the biggest issue here that we're facing, and obviously in the current dialogue, is what happens with families. And in the 2014 surge was the first time we saw tens of thousands of families coming to the border. The Obama administration actually detained families together. They made the decision, hey, we can't have no border for families. Let's detain families together through the pendency of their immigration proceedings, make a determination on whether they need protection or whether they should be repatriated, and then take that immigration action. That was a very effective initiative that kept families together and dramatically reduced the flow. This administration doesn't have that option. A district court in 2015 decided that families could not be detained together because the child couldn't be detained over 20 days, even if they were with their parents. So that basically meant that the families had to be released very quickly after arrival before they could complete an immigration proceeding, and they go to the back of that line with our immigration courts, a 700,000 person line, which is 5 years long or more in certain major areas. So that's not an effective deterrent at all. Your people are living in limbo, and they're not able to actually find out if they have a valid asylum claim for years at a time. We've got to address that. A better system would allow us to detain families together.
Well, I think, there are lots of pieces, as we mentioned. We've talked everything from what's happening in Central America and the need to work with those countries in improving their rule of law and their governance structures and economics, to working with the partners in Mexico. As we said, what happens at the border is only one piece of the puzzle. If you mentioned the deterrent effect of detention, and I think that's one of sort of the outstanding questions a lot of people have is understanding that, measuring that, figuring that out. There's been some research that came out this week that said that the efforts in 2014 maybe did not have a significant impact on the reduction.
That's simply inaccurate.
Okay, but I think that's one of the things. And then the other question is, you mentioned the immigration courts. If the process is one that's years and years long, and detention is the piece that you want to try to incorporate into that, that's a very long period for people to be, basically held. So we need to kind of look at the whole system and say, how do we, if this is the new reality, if our new reality is we're going to have more people from farther away, not just from Mexico, they're coming in different circumstances, more asylum seekers, more families and children, what are all of the pieces of this entire system that we need to look at? And I think that maybe one of the questions that comes up, you have control over a piece, right? Yeah. You have that border piece. You have colleagues at Immigration Customs Enforcement have another piece. You have colleagues at Department of Justice that have another piece. From this government's perspective, how do you link all those pieces together to figure out where the systemic issues are if you're just focusing on one or the other aspect?
Well, I do think there's a comprehensive strategy that's been offered to Congress, both in the fall when there was discussion over a deal for a legalization process for Dreamers with border security investments and closing the legal loopholes. I think it's pretty clear and consistent, our strategy. First is international engagement. Again, that's investing in Central America and working with partners there, as well as hopefully aligning our policies on migration with Mexico. We have an incoming administration. President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador had a strong mandate from the voters. We're looking forward to working with his administration to continue the significant collaboration levels we've had over the last 18 months. 3, it's investment in border security. We talked about those areas. We are receiving investment. It's important. We're going to apply it effectively. But then the 4th piece is the legal framework on the U.S. side. A number of proposals have been submitted to Congress. You mentioned the courts piece of this. Just wanted to clarify that one point. Individuals who are detained have a very expeditious court process. It's about 45 days on average. It's when they're released from custody and they go to a location where they're on an alternative of the detention, maybe for a period of time, an ankle bracelet, or they just have a touch-in, a connection point, they're not necessarily going to show up for their hearings, and their hearings are many years out. So they go on a non-detained docket that does not move as efficiently as those when they have people in custody. So the idea is not to detain people for years at a time. It's detain people through an efficient and fair immigration proceeding with due process.
I think there's probably still going to be an input-output process. If you detain more people, then those times for the detained docket may grow as well. So no matter what, I think that's an area we need to look at.
But our experience, and it's very clear, if you're able to detain people through a fair proceeding and then remove them effectively, the flows drop. The flows respond to that. And what's happened in the last 5 years, where we started with this conversation, is the change in flows have responded to where the gaps are in the legal system, and they're with families and children. That's why we have 40% crossing our border now, families and children, when it used to be under 5%, just as less than a decade ago. So it's a direct response to our immigration gaps.
So you mentioned working with your partners. You just came back from Mexico, I understand. Can you talk about some of the partnerships? What are you looking to do with them? I know that there's been conversations about whether or not we could work with them and whether or not they could take more of these asylum claims rather than people coming to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about what that is looking like?
You know, as one of the longest shared borders in the world, CBP has a unique role in partnership with Mexico from across their interagency, from Hacienda, or their tax and customs authorities on the one hand, all the way to Senacica, or their agriculture authorities on the other hand. We work with law enforcement elements, intelligence elements, military elements to address the various aspects of that joint border management. One of I think our biggest achievements recently has been facilitating the flow of trade in a coordinated manner with unified cargo processing. Instead of a cargo truck having to stop 3 times, we can do it together in one inspection, either on the U.S. side or on the Mexican side, depending on the location. So that's going very well. But in terms of migration policy, when you have a regional phenomenon with our neighbors in the Northern Triangle, and that is the major challenge that we're facing right now, you have to work together. We've seen that global examples where the transit countries and the destination countries have to partner to align policies. Otherwise, there's no ability to address flows and to really address the root causes by investing in the source countries. We need to talk to Mexico about the best way to do that. There are lots of tools that we can work with UNHCR, the Human Rights Commission, on potentially other ways to support asylum seekers, both in Mexico, other countries in the hemisphere, as well as the U.S. So I think there's a lot of ways we can approach this, and everything's on the table with the incoming team.
Okay. So one last area I wanted to ask you about. You know, we've had a couple of instances where there's been some policy changes that have been put forward in, pretty quickly, announcements that have happened, and you have a very large agency, and you have to implement those changes on a very fast turnaround. Can you talk to me a little bit about what happens when there's a policy announcement and that has to be operationalized? Like, what does that look like? How many people do you have to pull into a room? How do you get the word out? How do you ensure that things are being implemented in the way that you envision them out at the port of entry, out at the Border Patrol station?
Well, we have strong operational chains of command and effective follow-through and oversight. So when we have a new initiative we have to implement, and some, as you know, it could be a response to a threat, it could be a weather event that's an emergent issue, or it could be a policy change that we need to turn quickly to address. And that happens across our mission sets, whether it's counterterrorism, migration, trade. Recently, obviously, a number of new policies on the trade side with protecting security on steel and aluminum, as well as engaging with China. So we do this across our mission set. And what I think our key strength is, we have really strong leadership at the executive assistant commissioner level, and then chains of command that are used to applying changes in operations and policy very quickly and efficiently. So basically, we'll call the leadership team together. We'll ensure that we've correctly interpreted the operational or policy guidance we've received in accordance with counsel, and then we'll send out instructions to the field, and then we'll follow up. Many times in an emerging issue, you need to iterate and adjust. As you noted, and especially in immigration, we have a number of partners that we need to coordinate with, whether it's ICE, Health and Human Services. So we'll then have to get to that interagency level of coordination. But it's a process we're familiar with. You remember when you're in Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, we had so many elevations of the threat level to orange and red. You have to respond quickly, and so we've built those connective tissues and are able to react react effectively.
So it helps to know who you have to call on the other end of the phone.
Right.
Really quickly.
Exactly.
We have a few minutes. So there are written questions. I know we had asked that folks had questions to write them down. And if you have them and you want to raise them, we can just hold up your card. If not, we can continue talking for a little bit longer. Sure. Let's talk about your staff. The president has proposed hiring more Border Patrol agents. I know you have had, thank you, I know you have had for a long time a drumbeat to hire more people at the ports of entry to process the increasing.
Absolutely.
So talk about your hiring process. I know there's been some challenges with that. You know, you have a high attrition. That's government-wide. You have a lot of people who are reaching retirement age, and the government hasn't been able to. So what are you doing to try to address some of those personnel issues? You know, right now, before I guess we don't have congressional authorization for all the people you might want to hire, but how are you trying to address those right now?
So recruiting, hiring, sustaining a world-class workforce, law enforcement workforce is my top priority for the organization. It's number one by far. Just one quick clarification, we actually have pretty low attrition for a law enforcement agency, and that's actually benefited us greatly in the last several years as we're competing with, you know, sub 4% unemployment, with changes in recreational drug use policies and laws on the West Coast in particular, as we're competing for a very highly qualified and sound background workforce, mission-inspired people against all kinds of other entities in our economy and our government.
Who are your biggest competitors? Federal law enforcement agencies, FBI, U.S. Marshals?
Absolutely, yeah. We try to compete with each other and find the best and brightest out there between law enforcement. But no, I think industry is offering a lot of opportunity as well in this economy. So, you know, we're asking for people who can see a career path, who understand they're going to have a ton of opportunity all over the country with CBP, potentially an international deployment, who want to serve with a mission purpose and make an impact. So our hiring is going pretty well. We got support from Congress last year for 328 additional CBP officers. We're going to meet that hiring goal this year. We also have asked for, and both the House and Senate seem to be looking to support both Border Patrol agents and CBP officers in the next budget cycle. We've had challenges maintaining our Border Patrol agents over the last several years. That's turning around now, and we're very happy about that. We've improved how we administer our polygraph. We have a very rigorous background process, and you know, we're looking for the best and brightest who want an exciting mission-inspired career.
So when you have these hiring surges, I remember under the Bush administration we had a very big hiring surge in CBP and Border Patrol, and there were some impacts of that, some issues that came out later. How are you ensuring that, you know, accountability? How do you make sure that people are executing on their position professionally in the way that you want them to do?
Right. Well, I think we've greatly enhanced our background process. The prior surge you referenced was before the polygraph requirement, the Anti-Corruption Act. It's also before we really settled and expanded our Office of Professional Responsibility. We had the Homeland Security Advisory Council, a bipartisan panel called the Integrity Advisory Panel, take a look at our Office of Professional Responsibility and our integrity and accountability processes 2.5 years ago, and we've implemented the vast majority of their recommendations already. Our background process is as good as any in the federal government, and we feel confident that the people we're bringing in are going to meet all of the Americans' expectations on the accountability and integrity they have as officers and agents.
Okay. A couple questions here. We talked about what happens with asylum seekers when they come to port of entry and how there are capacity issues.
Okay.
Have you looked at surging additional personnel, like maybe bringing Border Patrol or other personnel from other agencies? Has CIS helped with maybe sending some of their asylum officers to the port of entry to conduct credible fear interviews there? I mean, what kinds of options are you thinking about? Again, if this is where you prefer people to apply, what are you doing to make that more possible?
So first of all, if we're successful in getting people to come to ports of entry instead of crossing between ports illegally, and still about 80% of the arrivals are between ports, unfortunately, we do want to be able to respond with additional resources. I mentioned our hiring initiatives for officers. Two of our top ports for asylum arrivals also happen to be our top 2 ports for hiring, Nogales and San Ysidro. So we're absolutely aggressively trying to hire for those ports. But looking at an interagency option, you mentioned the facilities challenge, looking at facilities options going forward. If this traffic is going to be a feature of what we see at the southwest border, depending the discussion on congressional solutions, on the international partnerships, that's something we would look at. Absolutely.
Some longer-term solutions. We talked a little bit about, international engagement, what role it plays in reducing the factors for illegal immigration. In your mind, thank you. In your mind, given the current flows, do you think that this is going to be a long-term trend, a 10-year trend, or are we? Is this, there's sort of a difference between you handle something that you think is a short-term kind of emergency, you surge resources, you can kind of make do. But if this is going to be a longer-term pattern, and changing the fundamental factors in Central America is a long-term prospect, how do you think you sort of strategically about that, and what changes you might want to make to your facilities, to the processes, people you have, and partnerships? Yeah,
so it might be longer term, but I don't think that we should shy away from investing heavily in our partnerships in Central America. We've got 3 good partners in the administrations there. If you look at El Salvador, the migration from El Salvador has reduced 65% this year. What they're doing is working both on the security front and on the economic opportunity front. We want to achieve those same successes in Honduras and Guatemala as well. So I think there's actually can be a more near-term reaction to sustained investment and really a whole of government on the U.S. side effort, ideally partnering fully with Mexico to support our Northern Triangle partners. So I think that's a near-term opportunity. I think if we can come up with an approach to protect asylum seekers in a shared vision with Mexico, with Canada, with other regional partners, that's also something we could do near-term. And the other thing that would dramatically change the situation is if our legal framework to address that asylum gap, the double standard for children, and the ability to detain families together, if we could get those 3 changes, that would dynamically affect the flows as well. So there are a lot of things that are relatively short-term that we could make a big impact with.
So my last question, what do you think is the biggest misconception people have? What do people not know about CBP that you wish they did?
Wow. Well, I think where you started, just the number of things we do, the number of ways we affect the security of the country, I think that's a good way to start that conversation. Securing and facilitating lawful trade and travel, trying to protect our communities from hard narcotics, those are tremendously important missions that we carry out, and we do so with a mission purpose. And so that's what I'd like to leave it with. I'd also just like to always thank our men and women, law enforcement professionals, who do a difficult and dangerous job with high integrity, and they do it with heart. They care about the people that they're interacting with. And so I just think that's really important to leave your audience with today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, audience, for dealing with us today and for joining us. The video of this will be available on our website later today or tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you join us for another event here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you.
Thank you.